Well, good morning, everybody. First thing to say is one of the problems about having the potential of a widescreen PowerPoint is that you can get away with the most ridiculously long titles for your lectures. I apologise for this, but I hope nonetheless that the question is a pertinent one. So, back to the elephant in the room, the Ordsall cord. We are obviously in the museum somewhere around here. Here we have the original Liverpool Road railway station. Here the line of the Liverpool to Manchester Railway. And here the new Ordsall cord cutting through it. I don't put that slide on in order to make any point about whether it was the right thing to do or not. Catherine has already referred to that, but simply to make the wider point that our railways today are under unprecedented pressure. Numbers travelling on the trains have doubled in the past 15 years, and those numbers are still rising. And while there is some scope for new routes, High Speed 2, High Speed 3 and so forth, to take some of the pressure, the bulk of that increase has got to be borne by the existing railway network. It's worth pausing to say an extraordinary amount of inbuilt flexibility was put into our existing railway infrastructure when it was built. This is Brunel's famous Maidenhead Bridge. When he built it, it probably had 12 trains a day running over it. Each of those trains might have weighed 100 tons, and it was travelling at 40 miles an hour. Today, in every hour, 26 trains are running over that bridge. They weigh not 100 tons, but 460 tons, and they travel not at 40 miles an hour, but 125 miles an hour. It's extraordinary the amount of what today we would describe as future-proofing, which has been built in to our modern railways. But nevertheless, there still needs to be an unprecedented programme of works to upgrade the infrastructure to take that level of use that it has today. And those upgrades fall into a number of categories. First of all, we need to increase capacity at stations. Catherine has already mentioned this in the context of Newcastle. This is Bristol Temple Meads, where virtually the sole entrance to the station at the moment is tiny it's woefully inadequate already compared with the number of people using it. But it's not just about increasing capacity at Bristol Temple Meads, it's also increasing retail and advertising revenue, which has to be used partly to fund all these increases, but it's also to reflect the fact that railways are now key parts of urban regeneration. There's a massive scheme for regeneration now in this area here, next to the station, but the station at the moment stands between it and the centre of Bristol. We've got to find ways of making Bristol Temple Meads and other stations not a block on regeneration, but an enabler of regeneration. There's a separate theme, which Simon has already referred to, the need to provide much better disabled access around and over stations, the so-called Access for All schemes, which has produced to date, it has to be admitted, some absolutely shocking architectural solutions, but a bit more of that later on. But equally, there needs to be an increase in the efficiency and capacity of our tracks. And the current government priority is railway electrification. And on the plan here you see marked in red the main schemes, the Great Western Railway to Cardiff and Swansea, the Midland north of Bedford, and the Northern Transpennine route. Electrification in many ways is fantastic. It's faster, it's greener, it's cheaper to run and cheaper to maintain, and the trains are quieter. The problem with electrification is in terms of kit, it requires an awful lot more than either steam or diesel. If you've got a steam train, all you needed was a pile of coal and some water every 50 miles or so. A diesel, you just needed a petrol pump at either end of the line. Electrification, however, and you see from the photograph on the right, requires masts to carry the wires every 50 to 60 metres, plus all sorts of other bits of kit, electricity substations and so forth. So whatever its wider environmental benefits, electrification visually and in terms of its impact is very much greater than what we've got at the moment. Put that together then with the fact that many of the lines and the associated structures which bear the brunt of those works are among the most important in the world, particularly when they date from that pre-1841 so-called pioneering phase of railways, when the modern railway was invented and producing an extraordinary variety of structures, many of which still look much as they did when they were built, but will need to be modified, sometimes significantly, for upgrades which are, as Catherine said, self-evidently in the national interest, which are going to happen almost whether we like it or not. So here, for example, we see, again on home turf, the original Liverpool Road station now part of the museum, on trying to answer that question of what should this brand new building type look like, a railway? What should a railway station look like? The answer here appears to be you make it look like a perfectly normal terrace of houses and just hope that people know where the entrance to this newfangled form of transport is. Then, on the North Midland Railway, this is the wonderful Belper cutting just north of Belper Station, engineered by the two Stevensons with Frederick Swanwick, opened in 1840. As you can see, there on the left, as it was when it opened, there it is today, almost unchanged apart from the Budlier. Also on the North Midland Railway, the wonderful Milford Tunnel North Portal, which was described at the time as being designed in a Saxon style, perhaps in deference to the dedication of the nearby Driffield Church to the Anglo-Saxon saint St Alcmund. And then perhaps the best of them all, famously Sydney Gardens in Bath, designed by Brunel to be a so-called theatre of the railway, where the polite classes taking the waters in Bath could get up close and personal to this brand new technology, this extraordinary phenomenon of the railways. And one of the wonderful things about Sydney Gardens is that all the engravings, all the photographs of it always have people in exactly the same position. If you look at the one on the right, that little family waiting for the train, and compare that with that little group of 3 people on the left, they are standing almost yard by yard in the same place as those people are today. It's got an extraordinary longevity of appeal. The challenge then is to how to make all these major changes to all these incredibly important structures without unnecessary harm to their special interest, or why not, let's aim higher, with actually to respond, not just to avoid unnecessary harm, but actually respond to the original very high design aspirations of Brunel, Stephenson's, and those other great early railway engineers. And we're not just talking here about the design of individual structures and original fabric, because the railway's wider relationship to its landscape, how it was seen from the landscape and how it was seen in the landscape, really mattered to those early railway engineers. And this is a wonderful from J.C. Bourne's Great History of the Great Western Railway, that sweeping approach to Bath. Clearly, gradients and alignments were important here, but Brunel, as with other railway engineers, really appreciated the drama of approaching the city of Bath or approaching somewhere. We've tended to lose that relationship between railways and the wider landscape. And this challenge raises what, for me, is a very interesting issue, and Simon touched on this actually just now, of how one measures the significance of engineering heritage, whether it's entire lines like the Great Western, designed by Brunel, or the North Midland, designed by the Stephensons, or the individual components of those lines, and how much weight should one give to the fact that an engineering structure is designed to function, to fulfill, it's designed to work, and if you take that function away from it, or if you compromise that function, it seems to me that you are seriously compromising the significance of that object. I think that's something which is very specific to engineering structures, and it's something which we have grappled. We haven't yet come to terms with how one includes that assessment of the significance of function in that wider consideration, Catherine referred to this, of really understanding the significance of these railway and other structures. There's also the fact that what can be protected by conventional designation, principally, I guess, listing here, does not necessarily encapsulate the engineering and landscape significance, which has more to do with the alignments, the cuttings, the embankments, the engineering. It's more to do with that than often the more modest and technically standard structures which end up getting listed. So here on the Great Western is, as the caption says, Bourton Bridge, listed at grade 2. A pretty, designed by Brunel, but a pretty run-of-the-mill, perfectly standard 19th century brick. I mean, Nigel said that there are 835 of them on his canal network. No, this is not dissimilar to one of those canal bridges, yet it's that which is listed, and there's no protection for the alignment, the vertical alignment and so forth of the railway, which is what is really important about Brunel's Great Western Railway. Still, given we're stuck, in a sense, with what we've got. So in our work on various railway electrification and other projects, we've tended to develop 3 criteria for really trying to tease out the significance of the listed or the designated structures. And the first of those criteria is, how do they reflect or contribute to the special interest, the special engineering interest of the line? This is Crawshaw Woods Bridge on the Leeds to Selby Railway, a very early one of 1834, and it is the oldest cast iron railway bridge still in use in the world. So that is a reflection of the way that engineers develop new types of structures to deal with their railways. It's clearly part of the engineering interest of the line. The second criterion is how they relate to the landscape setting of the line, particularly when viewed from the train. This is St Anne's Tunnel on the Great Western between Bath and Bristol, a wonderfully romantic structure, made even more romantic in Brunel's eyes when part of the structure of the tunnel mouth collapsed on the left-hand side. He thought it was so great that he left it as it is. Unfortunately, a slightly less romantic later engineer decided to patch it up, but nevertheless, a very clearer sense of how Brunel and the other engineers thought the landscape should be appreciated when you were travelling on the train. And then finally, how do the structures allow an appreciation of the railway as part of that wider landscape? And here in West London, the Warncliffe Viaduct triumphantly proclaims the presence of Brunel's Great Western Railway, very much putting it as part of the landscape, rather in the same way that that great viaduct in France that Catherine showed earlier on does exactly that. In a sense, we need to get back to the boldness of those early engineers. So with all that in mind, how have the challenges been met to date? Well, inevitably, there are some horror stories. This is the Slough Station Access for All Bridge, not high on the list of architectural achievements in the Network Rail design folio. There have been initial horror stories reflecting the very deep-set corporate culture in Network Rail, which for many years has been seen to be simply managing a transport system which was effectively in decline. Railways has had their day. We've just got to keep them going until they finally run out. Everyone was caught by surprise by this sudden renewed interest in rail travel, and it's taken a while for that kind of corporate mentality to reflect the fact that railways are once more the place to be seen travelling on. And that mentality is changing, and it's changing partly because Network Rail is increasingly getting its act together, but partly because we, as the heritage community, we've also got to understand more. So the result has been, in many cases, a much more productive partnership between Network Rail, their consultants, Historic England, the local planning authorities, which has really led to a really good level of discussion and debate, which has undoubtedly raised the design quality of the results. Because it's very important that it's not just for Network Rail to get its act together, we need to as well. We need to respond because these works will happen, and we need to work with Network Rail, not against Network Rail, in trying to agree solutions. So, in the first place, we have developed a much greater understanding about how railways work. They're incredibly complex, they're completely different. Ease, rapidity, cost of construction and maintenance, minimising disruption to the travelling public, safety are all critical factors to Network Rail. Good design can be added to the list, it can't be a substitute for any one of those other elements on the list. Secondly, we've very much improved our understanding of the history of the various lines. Catherine mentioned it earlier, the wonderful Leeds to Selby Railway. This is a wonderfully naive early picture of it. You'll see the train there pulled by a horse. The history of the railway network is surprisingly ill understood, perhaps because the focus of many historians has tended to be on the trains and the rolling stock rather than the engineering and the structures along the line. But also, it's been very much dependent on the interests of individual listing inspectors. So what we've seen repeatedly on the major lines that we've looked at, the Great Western, the Midland and so forth, is that a large number of structures which deserved listing simply hadn't been listed. They had not been picked up. This is a map of the listed structures along the Great Western Railway. There are about 99 of them in all. The first part of this project was an exercise to just check on the listings, and that resulted in an amazing 36 additional listings being made on the Great Western. A similar exercise on the Midland resulted in an extra 25 structures. The Leeds to Selby line picked up that Crawshaw Woods Bridge, which we saw earlier, which amazingly had not been listed, had not been spotted as being significant prior to that. And Network Rail wants to know this, and it wants to know it right at the start. And so it's really important that we work with them, and we have been working with them, and Historic England and the local authorities involved have been working to get that understanding from the start. It's also very important that we're realistic and we understand what are the fixes. There have to be masts for electrification. You can't change that, but what are the fixes and where is their flexibility? And we can then concentrate our efforts in those areas where there is design flexibility to minimize the impacts. Here on this slide showing how you can minimize the impact of the kit of masts, those masts every 50 or 60 meters, by thinking carefully about where you position them in relation to the key elements of the landscape. But equally at the same time, just as we've changed, so Network Rail has changed, particularly under intense public and heritage stakeholder scrutiny, and has developed some new technical solutions to get round what otherwise would have been problems. So, cutting back canopies on stations is often important in electrification because you have to have a certain width between the edge of the canopy and the wires. This is Bath's Bar Station, Grade 2 star, where the canopy would normally have been cut back, but what actually has happened is that Network Rail has taken advantage of the wide gap between the tracks to squeeze them together to enlarge the platforms to mean that you don't actually need to cut the canopies back here. You also get more capacity on what are already overcrowded platforms. An even bigger problem has been that of getting the wires underneath the various bridges on the line, like Bourton Bridge, for reasons which I hope are adequately set out in this slide here. When we started on the Great Western project 4 or 5 years ago, the Network Rail default position was if you can't get the wires underneath the bridge, you just knock the bridge down. And we started off with a long list of 11 bridges out of about 40 or so of the listed bridges on the Great Western, which had to be demolished. In the process of the past few years, that has now come down to one single bridge potentially needing to be demolished. And that's because Network Rail and we have really been forced to confront the challenges, find different ways of saving these structures. A crucial thing also has been the very important safety. So safety is critical, obviously, on electric railways. And so if you've got a bridge over the railway, you have to do something to the parapets of that bridge to stop people leaning over, dangling things over, and electrocuting themselves. And inevitably, there are some very, very strict safety standards. And they were, at the start, a real challenge to us, because they said, basically, that a bridge parapet had to be 1.8 meters high, and it's solid, and it had to have a kind of a spiky thing on the top, which meant that you couldn't sit on it. Most of the existing parapets on those Victorian railway bridges are about a metre and a half wide at the absolute most, and they have lovely wide flat copings for people to sit on. Gradually, however, under pressure again and questioning itself, Network Rail moved away from that very rigid standard, and most particularly they got to a stage where they realised that it's not the letter of the standard that you have to abide by, but it's actually what the standard is trying to achieve. And there was an absolute breakthrough, I think, in Bath, in the discussions about the various bridges running through the World Heritage Site, where an architect, Rhys Brooks of Harrison Brooks Architect, and I take my hat off to him, had an amazingly, a simple idea, as the best ideas usually are, of designing a railing based on actually a railing on a railway bridge in Bath, which did exactly what the standards were trying to achieve, which made it impossible or difficult for people to climb up onto the bridge to reach over, but still kept that crucial intervisibility between the people on the bridge and the railway running beneath. There's also, I think, been a renewed interest in Network Rail in good design. As Catherine said, they are setting up a design review panel. This is Steventon Bridge between Didcot and Swindon, which is the one which is very likely to need to be demolished. And this was the design. It was done by us at Alan Baxter's with Martin Knight, a bridge specialist architect, for the new bridge. It abides by all those Network Rail requirements to have standardised parts, to be able to be constructed overnight during possessions and so forth, but it has, I hope, that added ingredient of actually kind of a sense of good ordinary design. And the same is true of some of the electrification masts. This is one of the bridges over the Thames in the Goring Gap, where you can probably just about see the two, well, I hope you can't in a way see the two masts, which have been designed to be as thin as possible, but also are orientated in a way that when you are looking at them from this critical viewpoint on the towpath, you see as little of the mast as possible because it's orientated straight along your line of view. So when all this comes together, then it works well. And this is an example from Glen Eagles in Scotland of an Access for All bridge, which has been very, very carefully and sensitively designed to fit in with the existing footbridge and put in the lifts in such a way that they don't completely dominate, both in terms of style and bulk, the existing station. It's not to say that it's not a very, very complex matter. Railways are very, very difficult. They're their own particular world. And there will need to be some demolition. So, for example, the Grade 2 listed train shed at London Bridge Station had, in the end, to be demolished in order to enable the Thameslink improvements. And there are still going to be some very significant challenges. So this is Kettering Station on the Midland Main Line, wonderful cast iron canopies, very unusually gable end onto the railway. But as you can see from this photograph, unlike in Bath Bar Station, there isn't the space for squeezing the tracks any closer together. So something will need to be done to cut back those canopies at Kettering Station. And we're having at the moment very interesting and productive discussions about how best to achieve this with Historic England and the conservation officer involved. It is a challenge, but together I'm sure we can reach it. So, it seems to me, I hope at least, that with care, with thought, and perhaps above all with cooperation, with understanding each other's needs, requirements, and so forth, that a modern railway can be designed to be compatible with its heritage. Thank you very much indeed.